All right, so welcome everyone. Like I said, this is our very last Science Of for the year. We will be starting again in January, kind of towards the end of January with a bunch of new topics. So I'm excited to plan those out. But again, thank you for joining us and all the people that have joined throughout the year. I really appreciate it. I hope you have learned a lot. Today, we're going to be talking about migration. And so like I mentioned earlier, I didn't really plan for it to be today. There's a little bit of shifting around in our fall schedule. So it works out great because that's what a lot of animals are doing right now. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this and let you know that it's not just birds. A lot of people think it's just birds that migrate, and there's a whole other type groups of animals that will do this. So my name is Monica McCoubry, and I am the Wildlife Education Specialist with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission here in the Lincoln office. So I will go ahead and share my screen and we can get started on our migration journey for the day. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right, so like I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about migration. Please keep that to kind of our topic today. I would love it if you ask questions. Please, you can either utilize that chat function or you can email me afterwards, but please, whatever you use in that chat function, just make sure that it is on topic to what we're talking about and that you're kind to everyone. And I'm sure we will not have an issue. And then just as another reminder to everybody, I am by no means an expert. I don't say that I'm an expert on anything. I would love to be someday, but I really love science. I do a lot of research for this. So if there are questions at the end that we cannot answer, I will find someone that can answer those questions for you. So thank you for joining us again. I really appreciate all of our people that have stuck with me this long. All right, so today, migration. So when we think about migration, and I'm sure most of us and even our kids, when we ask migration, the first animal that usually comes to their mind is probably bird, some type of bird. But we kind of have always heard that birds just migrate for the winter. And so there's a lot of misconceptions when we talk about migration. Why are they doing it? Why? What species are doing it? Where do they go? A lot of times you hear they go south. That's not entirely false, but there's a lot more to the story than they just go south. So like I talked about, most people think about animals that are birds. It's that seasonal movement of birds between a breeding ground and a non-breeding site. And that's a lot of it. A lot of our migrants, even in Nebraska, they are birds. Bird migration is what actually attracts a lot of people to the interest of migration. So even those non-kind of biological science people, when they hear about these amazing epic journeys like our Santo cranes, that really gets them involved in something. And so migration is usually one of those first kind of natural phenomenons that people hear about and interest them in the science world. But when we talk about migration, it's not just going south for the winter time. There's east and west journeys. So some animals are on the east coast and they go to the west coast because it's warmer. Some animals do the opposite. There's also round, long trips that we're going to talk about today that animals will go over land and ocean, very long, epic journeys. There's also altitudinal journeys. So thinking about animals that move up or down a mountain, depending on above sea level or below sea level for their migration. And then also just vertical movements within the water column. So even some of our fish species, they will go to the bottom. We don't necessarily think about that as a migration journey. It's not anything like the Santo cranes or the Monarch butterflies, but it is still migration. They are moving to another place. And usually kind of a catch-all for our definition of migration is going to be that they move from one habitat to another. So that new habitat could be 20 feet away, or it could be 500 feet away, or it could be 3,000 miles away. There's a lot of different things when we talk about migration. All right, so who actually migrates? We know a lot about birds, but almost every single branch in the animal kingdom has some type of animal that will migrate. So we have fish, there's crustaceans, there's amphibians, reptiles, insects, mammals. And if any of you know what slime molds are actually migrants as well. So there's a lot of different types of animals and organisms that are migrating. It's not just birds. All right, so I kind of wanted to begin by talking about some of these world record holders when we talk about our migrant animals. None of them, unfortunately, except for one, I guess, we have here in Nebraska, but still kind of cool to mention. The smallest migrant in the world is only about 1 to 2 millimeters long, and that's the zooplankton. The largest migrants are blue whale. The longest mammal migration is about 5,200 miles each way, so about 10,000 miles round trip. Think about that. It only makes sense that it's the humpback whale. So large animal, larger distances to cover. The longest insect migration, which is about 3,000 miles, give or take, is our monarch butterfly, which is found here in Nebraska. The longest recorded trip ever was about 50,000 miles, and that was the Arctic tern. And that's actually the photo that I have here. So if you're like, well, I've never heard of that animal, here you go. Here's a photo. And then the highest migration, we talked earlier about the altitude changes in different animals. So it's measured in what's called ASL, and that's just above sea level. So 9,000 feet, degrees, whatever you want to call it, above sea level. And that's something called the bar-headed goose. So lots of different things. There's some insects on there, again, lots of birds, but then a lot of people kind of forget about whales too. And I know that is not something that we have here in Nebraska, but still something worth mentioning. All right, and then when I was kind of doing this, I found this just absolutely fascinating. We do not have this animal in Nebraska, but it's called the Bartailed God Whip. And this bird over here kind of looks like a woodcock, a little bit, sandpiper kind of bird. They breed in Alaska, and they will migrate south. And it's to its non-breeding site, which is usually sometimes in Australia, Southeast Asia, New Zealand, around that area. They can fly over 9 days without stopping, 8 or 9 days, give or take. They make about a 6,000 mile journey, but over 9 days, they do not stop. They just continue flying. So they cross the Pacific Ocean. They go across all these different types of landmarks, but they know where they're going 6,000 miles later. And if you think about it, we'll talk about this here in a little bit later, but it's a lot of energy that they're burning, so they have to eat a lot of fat. So the amount of food that they eat to make that journey is just probably incredible. But again, we don't have this bird in Nebraska, but something that's kind of neat. I mean, I can't walk. I probably could walk for 9 days straight if I had to, but flying and burning all that energy, that's a lot for this little tiny bird. All right, so when we talk about animals that migrate, why do they migrate? A lot of times in school, you were just told that, oh, it's cold, they're migrating. That's not really the story at all. So it's just an adaptive response to a seasonal or geographic variation of resources. So that sounds really fancy, but basically, is the season changing? Is the weather changing? Is the photo period or the amount of light that those animals are receiving? That all kind of triggers them, and their body knows that sometimes they need to migrate. And as we know, not all of our animals migrate. A lot of them will stay here throughout the whole year. But seasons will also change the intensity of the amount of solar energy that the hemisphere is receiving. And that's another reason why animals will sometimes migrate. They will leave an area for many reasons. A lot of it is food and food availability. So sometimes they need certain food resources that are not in this area for a certain time of the year. So if they're reproducing, or if they are already pregnant and they need to eat that extra fat and protein, they might not have those resources available in the area that they are, so they have to migrate. Or sometimes their foraging times are just really cut short. Right now, we're all in that kind of fall transition period. Our animals are feeling it too. So the amount of light is getting shorter. The amount of food that's going to be around here fairly soon is going to kind of decrease. And a lot of those animals just can't take that. So they're going to have to go somewhere else. But often the resources that are needed, like we talked about here, different life stages need different amounts of food, and that food is sometimes located in different areas. And again, not all animals migrate, not all animals in Nebraska migrate, and not all species choose to migrate. There's a lot of animals that some animals of that species will migrate, and some choose not to. So the reasons why animals migrate, the main one is basically about the resources. It's about finding food. So many animals will migrate because the area that they are currently in is either going to be very sparse, or it is low on nutrition and variety of food. So a lot of our animals, like our birds, they're not going to have those resources. And it's not going to have a lot of trees on or leaves on the trees. There's not going to be a lot of insects around. So they need to go find that food somewhere else. Not in Nebraska, but a perfect example of this is zebras, gazelles, wildebeest. These have amazing migrations. The wildebeest migration is something that you can see from satellite images in space. And they basically, those herds, they're looking for food. They need fresh grass and they need water. And during the dry season in the area that they're living in, just simply can't provide that. Another example is our humpback whales. So they migrate to look for food, things like krill and small fish that have moved into a different area up north. And then when they are done feeding, they come back to the warmer areas to raise their calves. All right, another reason is like our climate and our seasons. If you are from Nebraska, you know that it gets pretty cold here during the winter time. We also have some freak weathers. Sometimes it's cold, it's hot, it's snowy, all of a sudden it's 70 degrees. So the climate shifts a lot. One of those animals that can't really handle the cold is our monarch butterflies. So they will migrate basically to avoid the cold temperatures in the wintertime. They cannot survive those freezing temperatures. So some of them will fly all the way from Canada to Mexico at times. There are different types of monarchs that will fly to different areas, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But one thing that's neat is they make this journey over generations. So it's not necessarily the exact same butterfly making this entire trip. They stop along the way to make lay eggs on milkweeds. And so those insects, when they hatch them, those butterflies will then continue the journey. So it's kind of neat. So caterpillars will eat and then they will continue the journey as adult butterflies. So again, it's really that cold reason that they can't control and they can't stand being in the cold. There are also some animals that mate simply for reproductive reasons. This isn't a huge portion of the animals that migrate, but it is something to note because a lot of animals do this. So like our whales that we talked about, they will actually move back to go to an area that's warmer to raise their calves. So for instance, salmon, they start their life in the rivers, they will migrate out to the sea to feed. And then after about 7 years in the ocean, they will migrate back to their area so that they can spawn. So we, again, do not have salmon in Nebraska, but it's something to note. That's a reproductive reason. If you've also ever heard of the Christmas Island red crabs, if you haven't, please take a second after this. Don't not listen to me here, but take a second after this to look on some YouTube videos. There's this really cool island and all of these red crabs that I have here. They just cover the area. So they spend a lot of their time in the forest, but then they will migrate to the ocean to reproduce. So they're not making a huge journey. They're literally on an island and they're moving from one side of the island to another for reproductive reasons. And then something else like what's a trigger? How do they know when to migrate? So a lot of people, they don't give animals enough credit, but they know that things change. So right now we're in the fall period. We are losing 43 minutes of daylight this month. So if you've noticed that you're outside, it's getting darker earlier, it's darker in the morning. So we call that the photo period. So the amount of light in the day is decreasing and that triggers animals to know that a change is coming. Also the temperature, it's cooler in the morning. It's kind of that weird transition zone of should I bring a jacket? And you bring a jacket and then you regret it later because it's so hot outside. And then also the hormones. So certain animals, certain species, they will have a hormone transition that will trigger them to migrate. So a lot of people think that in birds, they have this gonadal condition basically in the spring. This hormone triggers them to migrate in the spring, but then not in the fall. And then some insects will have these juvenile hormones that basically will tell them when to transition between being a migratory and their reproductive life cycles. And then some animals, it's just an annual reproductive cycle in some that makes them trigger. So there's a lot of different things depending on the type of animal and the species. All right, so how do you prep for migration? So we know a lot of animals, they eat a lot of food. Sometimes that's true, but there's a lot of other things that happen like anatomy wise as well. So A lot of our animals, they will forage on their migratory route. So a perfect prime example is our sandhill crane. So they come here, they feed on the Platte River, and then they continue their journey. A lot of animals will do this, but some, they will feed like super intensely prior to departing. So that is known as hyperphagia. So this is a lot of animals, and then they will not usually eat on that migratory route. So like that God Whip that we talked about, the one that flies for 9 days, they do not stop. They have to keep going. And so they like have a bunch of food, they make a bunch of fat reserves, and then they wear it off those 9 days as they're using all that energy to migrate. This is also seen in a variety of species, like our monarch butterflies will do this, caribou do this, baleen whales will do it. It's all about that circannual rhythm. So not our circadian rhythm, but circannual rhythm, that a yearly cycle instead of the day and night cycle. All right, so again, how do they prep? They need a ton of fat, and the most efficient type of energy that they can use is fat. So about 8 to 10 times more energy than the same amount of carbs or protein. So fat is very important to them. Migrants are capable of storing and hosting and metabolizing a lot of that fat. Some birds will even double their body size and the weight so they can fly those distances. A lot of us also might be thinking, well, isn't that less efficient because they're heavier and they're burning more energy to fly? Yes, but over time they use so much energy, they wear it off basically by the time they get to their breeding or their non-breeding sites, and then they eat a bunch more. Monarchs, for instance, they can store about 125% of lean, dry weight as fat. So it's not that super heavy for them to fly and make that 3,000-mile journey. All right, some other animals, they will literally change their anatomy. So migration is very energetically expensive. So what they will do is they minimize the excess weight and maximize, like for instance, in birds, their flight efficiency. So their muscles that they use, their heart to pump all that blood through and oxygen through their body, and then their flight muscles will actually increase. And then things that they don't really need, like their stomach, their kidneys, their liver, it's important, but they shrink them. So they're not super important in those 9 days or whatever that they're using to fly. So they will shrink those and then increase their heart and their flight muscles to make them more energy efficient when they're flying. And then when they return to their breeding or non-breeding site, they start eating regularly again, and their whole anatomy will kind of go back to normal. So it's kind of interesting that birds can do that. I didn't really read about any other animals that do that, but there's a lot that we also don't know about migration. So we know a lot, but there's still a lot of mystery out there too. All right, so do we have any questions in the chat? That's awesome. Someone said that they raised monarch butterflies. That's very, very cool. It'd be interesting to see if you had like tagged any of them, or if someone could tag them and we could find them in the Mexican forest or in California. So very cool that you do that. All right, so one thing about migration that's still a huge mystery for a lot of us is how do they get there? So you might have heard that some animals will look at the stars, some animals use the magnetic field of the earth. There's a lot of things that happen. And so again, it's kind of a mystery. We're not really sure how animals do this. Is it just instinct, or is it some kind of cue that they follow? So this is kind of what we do know. There are 2 types of cues when we talk about them migrating. So there's visible and invisible cues. So visible cues are some animals, when they go to migrate, they look at that local topography. So they look at the land and how high some areas are, or what landmarks they're looking at. So like also that triggers the polarized light patterns. So basically how the light scatters when it hits those airborne particles. So as the sun moves during the day, that pattern in the sky will change. And they also look at the stars and the position of the night sky. So these are things that they can visibly see. And then you have these invisible cues. So sometimes animals will use a smell to get from place to place. And they also will use those magnetic fields or the magnetic pull of the earth. These are things like birds, butterflies, salamanders will even do this. Yes, there are salamanders that will migrate, not Nebraska, but they are some. All right, so just a few of them. There's a lot of different ways that animals kind of trigger to migrate and how they find their areas. One of them is genetics. There's a ton of scientists out there that truly believe that animals will inherit their migratory maps from their parents. There has nothing that says this is not true. There's not a lot that says it is, but there's a lot of scientists out there that truly believe they inherit those migratory maps. There's also mental maps. So if someone asked you how to draw a map from your house to get to the grocery store, you could probably do it. This is, again, that's mental maps. You know the landmarks, you know what streets to turn onto. There's rivers, there's trees. A lot of these help the animals, especially for smaller migration journeys. Especially those that go from altitudinal migrations up and down a mountain. There's also instinct. A lot of animals just know where to go. And then that's what they're sticking with. So for instance, dolphins, they will follow the topography of the ocean floor and they just think, okay, this is right. I know how to get there. And then there's also, again, those visible cues. So things like the sun and the moon. Starlings, for instance, will orient themselves on their migration route depending on the path of the sun. So this is something that's very helpful for them. All right, we have stars, just like people in ancient times that use stars to navigate and sailors that use this to navigate, same thing. The North Star, something that's very bright and visible that they can usually always see. For instance, mallard ducks, they look at the North Star because it helps them find north. So as long as they can find that direction, they know where they're going. Some animals will use a smell or that olfactory trigger. So they look at a map, they can smell these scents. For instance, salmon will use this to find areas to lay their eggs. And then there are some animals, they use the magnetic field. This one is still very new for scientists and biologists. We have no idea what's going on. There's a lot of research out there, but there's not a lot of sure things about it. We know that animals do this, but we're not really sure how they do this. So some animals, they just kind of know where to go and they use that pull of the magnetic field. All right, some animals also communicate and they signal along the way. So whales, they make a lot of sound. So there's kind of usually one whale that kind of leads the way and, hey guys, we're over here in whale. So that helps them. And then some animals will follow the ocean currents. So they helps with navigating from the breeding and the non-breeding grounds. Fish will usually purposely go against the current because they feel in their head that that is correct. And it helps them get from place to place by simply going through that ocean current. And if you've ever watched Finding Nemo, if you ever see the beginning, kind of towards the middle, I guess, when Nemo is helping find his way, Crush the turtle will help him. You can see those kind of weird ocean currents and he says, okay, get in the current, and he slides down the slide. That's what I always think of. But all right, so talking about some Nebraska migrants. So what do we have in Nebraska that is migrating? Where do they go? Why are they migrating? Someone asked here, fat stores 8 times as much energy as protein and carbs. Carbs and proteins. Yep, okay. And then someone also asked, I watched a show once that say there are 4 generations of monarchs, 3 shorter cycles of generations heading north and 1 super generation heading back south. But I also seen caterpillar this fall, so I'm not totally sure. Yes, I've seen caterpillars even 2-3 weeks ago. We'll talk about this a little bit. A lot of scientists believe that climate change has a lot to do with this. It's changing entire biologies and the way and the cycle that they produce or reproduce. We'll talk about one like the dragonflies. They believe that that's happening similar to that as well. All right. Do one thing here. Okay, perfect. All right. So talking about Nebraska migrants, so monarch butterflies are ones that they make about a 3,000-mile journey, and we have them in Nebraska. So they're the only butterfly that is known to make a 2-way migration like birds. So these butterflies, they do not winter like other butterflies. They can winter on as larvae or adults even. These are a little different just because the colder climates in the north. They will use a lot of the environmental cues. So the photo period, that time of day and the amount of light that they're receiving, the temperature, even the leaves, they're changing color. Things are changing and they know. They also use a combination of air currents and thermals to travel those long distances. So if you think about these animals, these birds and these insects that are making these super long journeys, they're not sitting there constantly flapping their wings. They use different resources to help them travel more efficiently. So things like air currents and thermals. And you think about it, something like a monarch, it weighs less than a paperclip. Not a lot, a strong breeze is going to carry them a very long way. So that helps them too. These guys, it kind of depends on which group of monarchs, depends on where they go for the winter time. So the monarchs that are found kind of in the eastern North American side, they will travel to the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. And then the western monarchs usually go to California. So California doesn't really have a huge temperature change like Nebraska does for the winter time. It's usually pretty constant and the monarchs can survive there. The ones that travel to Mexico, they make the same journey to the same about 11 to 12 different mountain ranges about from October, so about right now, to late March. And so they purposely go to these specific mountain ranges and they will only roost in these things called the Oyamel fir forests. They have the warm temperatures, they have very high humidity, so they don't waste the energy. A lot of the times, if you ever see photos, you see so many monarchs kind of clustered together. Sometimes they are so heavy. Remember, they weigh less than a paperclip. There's so many monarchs that the branches will break. So that's a lot of monarchs. And then again, biologists still really aren't 100% sure how they navigate, but we know that they use the magnetic pull of the earth, and we also believe that they use the position of the sun. So this is one that, again, we know a lot about it, but there's still a lot of mystery when it comes to monarchs and how they migrate to and from places. All right, one of our other kind of underrated birds is our whooping cranes here. So these guys, they will spend the winter in the Gulf of Mexico, and then they arrive about now, arrive in the south about mid-September, so maybe a few weeks ago. And then every year they will migrate pretty much through Nebraska. They make a 2,500-mile journey north to Canada and the northern kind of US states. And what's cool about these guys is they will migrate during the day in very small family groups or very small flocks. They don't do this huge migration like starlings that are thousands upon thousands in a single flock. They travel along these very narrow corridors. If you ever look at a map of the United States and look at the migration routes, we have one that goes right through Nebraska, kind of like an hourglass. Very neat. Once they reach the north, they will build their nests, they raise a single chick, and then they will migrate back. All right, this one I thought was kind of interesting. I talked to our big game biologist and he confirmed this here. So we talked earlier that migration is not always these 1,000-mile journeys. Sometimes, like our pronghorn, sometimes people call them pronghorn antelope or antelope, same thing. They only migrate about 70 miles, but they do consider it a true migration. So through Game and Parks research, we've actually found that the pronghorn that are in kind of the sandhills area, when it snows and it gets very cold, there's not a lot of food and it's very sparse. So they will actually migrate to the peripheral kind of area of the sandhills, and they'll stay there for the winter time because there's more food. And then during the summertime, they will migrate back into the sandhills because it is such a great and valuable resource in an area, but it's not really great for the winter time. This is like 100% a food-oriented migration. So they are trying to find food. What they kind of tracked is that, for instance, they spend their summers towards the Alliance area. And then for the winter time, they'll kind of migrate out to Thedford. So again, they're in the sandhills, they migrate out, and then they come back. All right, this is like the most noted migration. Every single year we hear about the Santo crane. So 400,000 to 600,000 Santo cranes, which is about 80% roughly of all of the Santo cranes on the planet, will come through Nebraska. They usually use this about 80-mile stretch on the Platte River. They will eat the kind of wasted grain that farmers have left in the fields. They will get really fat. They get about 20% of their body weight, and then they will migrate then north, keeping going. So Usually it kind of has been changing the last about 5-10 years. Usually begins to see them about mid-February, and they leave, the last kind of ones leave at about mid-April. So again, it's kind of been a little change. If you follow like the Crane Trust or Roe Sanctuary, they usually put on like, today we saw the first crane, or today we saw about this many. So it's kind of interesting to go back and look at that data and see how the sightings have changed over the past 5, 10, 15 years. So with the Santo cranes, there's also a lot of other birds that come that aren't really as noted, but there's about 20 million other migrating birds that come along with the Santo crane. That's about 300 species that also stop along that 80-mile stretch of the Platte River. So that's about 280 whooping cranes that we talked about earlier, 90% of all the white-fronted geese, thousands of piping plovers, 30% of the northern pintails, which is what I have pictured here. So if you're like, I don't know what that is, this is what a pintail looks like. 50% of all the mallards, a lot of bald eagles, and around about 2 million snow geese come through. So again, not as noted as the Santo cranes, but still there's a lot of these other spring birds that are coming through as well. All right, one that you might still be seeing, maybe just kind of towards the edge here, are our ruby-throated hummingbirds. I probably have seen more hummingbirds this fall than I've ever seen in my life. These guys are very, very small, but they are mighty. They fly around 2,000 kilometers without taking a break. In the fall, they will travel from the eastern United States. So Lincoln, Omaha area could be one of those areas. And they go to about central or even closer to like South America. The fall migration will peak in September. So they pretty much should be done migrating. If you're still seeing some, that's okay. Leave your feeders out. Older birds will travel ahead of the younger birds. And what scientists have found is that they arrive earlier and in better condition. So basically they're experienced, they're socially dominant, they know what they're doing. The younger birds just simply don't have that experience, and they don't arrive in as good of condition. So the older birds, they will leave earlier and they will travel faster. The younger birds will leave later and sometimes arrive in kind of a little bit more of a rough condition. All right, so dragonflies, a lot of people know about the monarchs, but they don't necessarily think that there's a lot of other insects that migrate. Here's a great example, the green darner dragonfly, which is what I've pictured here. This is extremely hard to track their migration. They're too small for radio trackers, and they don't travel in large swarms all the time. Sometimes they're even caught on like Doppler radar. They can see a huge swarm of dragonflies. These guys usually about between February and March. The first generation, this is a multi-generational thing, they will emerge from the bodies of water, ponds and lakes down in the southern US, Mexico, and the Caribbean. They will then travel all the way north to about New England or the upper Midwest about May. Once they get there, they lay their eggs and they die. So the next generation, then that second generation, will kind of hang out. They'll overwinter in ponds in the north, what's called during their nymph stage. And then when they reach maturity, they will head south again in about July and October. So this is what their nymph stage looks like. If you ever see one of these, this is a baby dragonfly. So dragonflies reach the south, they will deposit another batch of eggs. These will then mature for that third generation, and they will actually have a non-migratory life. So they overwinter on the coast, they produce the eggs, and then those eggs will then go north again in the spring. This is one of those species where climate change has really affected their migration. They believe that they're staying later in the fall, they're migrating north earlier, all because of our climate changing. Scientists believe that this could be super detrimental for our dragonflies. They could alter the entire biology and their life history simply because of when they are migrating. All right, and then we don't have a lot of mammals in Nebraska that hibernate, that migrate. Not hibernate. And then one of them is our bats. So a lot of our bats will stay here and find a place to roost for the winter time, but there are some notable that, like their hoary bat here, that will migrate. So for bats, migration has a very strong effect on the genetics and the population structure of our bats. And a lot of the times they don't migrate together. So during the active season, The females and males migration is very different. The females will migrate longer distances and they will form these really large maternity colonies. The males will not. The males usually spend the summer in the mountains. They kind of take it easy. And then they will roost in areas like north central, northeastern US. Nebraska is one of those areas where they actually can come together. So usually they're solitary, but males and females in Montana, Nebraska, kind of the Badland areas, they are known to kind of be found together. But the hoary bat is one of those bats that makes the longest distance migrations of any bat. So we do have them in Nebraska. It's really hard to see, but they are kind of the silvery, grayish salt and pepper color. Very cool looking bat. All right, so I think we have a few things in the chat here. Let's see, we know where Western monarchs go in. Where do monarchs go in California? I'm not exactly sure where. I'm guessing somewhere southern that's warm. Not sure the exact city or the location. Why are Santo crane fall migrations not as massive in numbers? So a few of them, it depends on the subspecies of Santo cranes. There are some that like spend the entire year in Florida just because the climate is just perfect for them and they choose not to go. We just also don't see them in those mass numbers anymore. They all kind of trigger at the same time to go for the spring, but the fall is very different for some reason. We just don't see those massive numbers. Someone said, I've seen thousands of green darners in a swarm around the later part of August. That is very cool. I think last year, a couple years ago, they had the Weather Service caught this huge migration of dragonflies, a swarm on Doppler radar, and they posted it on their, I think their Facebook or social media, but it was just this massive swarm of dragonflies. Had a hummingbird touch my arm with his beak while standing open garage door. Very cool. Like I said, yeah, I've seen more hummingbirds this fall than I ever have before. Not sure why. Yeah, someone also says sometimes after dark, you can hear them flying south from a high altitude. They follow the rivers like Missouri south. So yes, thank you very much. All right, we'll keep going. We have one more thing. I did want to add this just because I think it's interesting. Like, how do we study this migration? How do we know that this is happening? How do we figure out where they're going or what animals or what? There's a lot of different things that biologists will use. One of them is bird banding. So this photo here, you can kind of see there's this little plier-like material or equipment that they use to kind of push the band on the birds. So this dates back to about 1899. So this guy visited the starling and then he wanted to keep track of them. So he gave each bird a nestling, a leg band that was engraved with a return address and then a serial number that was unique to the bird. Since then, about 200 million birds have been banded worldwide. We do this in Nebraska. Very cool. There's a couple of guys that do it kind of in the eastern area, and then out in western Nebraska, the Bird Conservancy does it. But only a fraction of these birds that are banded are usually recovered. So about 1 in 300 birds. So if a bander ever finds one that they've banded, it's a very special treat. Instead of doing the bands, they can also label this thing with dye, and they attach these little tiny plastic tags to the neck or the back, which does not affect the bird, how it flies or anything like that, because that would be counterproductive. So, all right, we talked about radar. So radar was developed during the World War II. They've actually tracked a lot of bird migration journeys with radar. So it's very technological advance now that they can pinpoint the height, the speed, and even the wing beat rate of certain birds and even bats. Not quite to there with the insects yet, but they can pick up the very large swarms. There was one just a few weeks ago, the monarchs were moving through. And then like I said, a couple years ago, they had the dragonfly one. And then there's the sonar, which is what they use, the aquatic equivalent, and they can detect the fish moving underwater and things like whales. All right, there's also tracking devices. So radio transmitters, telemetry antennas will help animals. The only problem with this one is you have to be within a few kilometers of the animal to figure it out. So there are satellite transmitters, they're very expensive, but they record the data within minutes. So if you want to find out where your bird is, you have a satellite tracker on them, you can pinpoint, it'll bounce off the satellite and come back to your computer, and you can say bird number 394 is right here. So very kind of cool. There's a lot of different types of these. This one photo I have here, it's really the only one I could find that was a free image, but it has it on a mountain lion. You also will see these collars. Game and Parks will collar our mountain lions. We collar pronghorn, deer, lots of other animals. There's also these things called geolocators, which are miniature light level loggers. So when an animal has one of these, we can record everything about that animal, even something like the sunset and the sunrise, where that animal was located, the time, the amount of light, everything. And then the only thing is, some of these collars, they have to be retrieved to access that data. So not every single one bounces off a satellite and comes to your computer. But like I said, those are expensive. And the only thing is, sometimes the animal loses the collar, the battery goes dead, and you can't find it. And unfortunately, you lose all that data. And then something that's kind of making a new name for itself here, you might have heard some people talk about them, are these stable isotopes. Basically what they are, it's just these elements, nitrogen, sulfur, oxygen, carbon, all of these different things that are found in the tissues of animals. And when you take their stable isotopes, you can match where in the world these animals have come from, because they're all unique. For instance, they can match things like vegetation for the breeding grounds, and then they can serve as an indication of the place where that animal was born. They actually even use it in Nebraska for a lot of our snakes. They will take stable isotopes and figure out where that animal originated. This is the same technique that's used to find things like the hatching places of monarch butterflies that are overwintering in Mexico. All right, so that was a lot of information, but that was our very last science of. So I hope that you learned a ton of information about migration today. And if you've been joining us for the past 5-6 weeks or so now, I hope you learned a lot more information. If you've missed any of them or would like to check out what videos and information we have, you can go to our Nebraska Game and Parks Education YouTube channel. And then we have a lot of playlists on there, but you find the playlist Science of, and it has all of the ones that we have ever done. We also have a education Facebook page that we announce a lot of our events at. We're having a very cool bat panel coming up in October. October is tomorrow, I guess, is going to be reptile month. So Nebraska Reptile Month, and we're going to be having a lot of reptile stuff. We have an Instagram page, we have our education website. And then with that, are there any questions? I don't see anything in the chat, but I wanted to open it up. I will stop sharing my screen here. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I really appreciate all of you coming to this, giving up your hour, 45 minutes or so with me in the afternoon. And I hope that you will join us again in the end of January. So if there's any questions, I'll stay on for a couple more minutes. Otherwise, I appreciate all of you. Thank you guys so much.